Hannah Greer buried her husband on the second Tuesday of October in 1883 in the little fenced plot on the rise above the wheat field he had broken with his own hands. And by the time the first snow came, she would have a roof that did not leak, a stove that drew clean, and a man in town who had done both without once being asked. But standing at the graveside that gray morning, her boy's cold hand in hers, she did not know any of that yet. She knew only that Tom was in the ground, that the wheat had come in thin and gone for less than the seed had cost, and that there were 160 acres of failing homestead, and one winter coming, and nobody now to face either but herself. She was 29 years old. She had married Tom Greer at 19, and come west from Indiana in a wagon with a milk cow tied behind. And for 10 years they had wrung a living out of a quarter section north of the rail and mill town of Wheat Cross, Kansas. The two of them, and then the three of them when Will was born. Tom had been a strong man and a hopeful one, too hopeful, and the homestead had always run a season behind itself. A roof half shingled, a barn door off its hinge, a debt at the mercantile carried harvest to harvest on the strength of next year. Of every unfinished thing he would grin and say the same words, "I'll get to it." Then, in the last week of September, a load of cut timber had shifted off the wagon and come down on him. He lingered 4 days, and on the 4th he died. And next year wasn't coming for Tom Greer any more. It had all fallen, the whole unfinished weight of the place, onto a widow and an 8-year-old boy. The town came to the burying, because a town will come to a burying, and then the town went home. The neighbor women left a ham and 2 loaves on the table and were gone before noon, the way people leave quickly from a house where the trouble is too big to be fixed by a ham. By that evening, as Hannah well knew, the talk had already started in the warm back room of the Vane Mercantile, that the Greer place had always been cursed, that Tom had been a poor manager, that no widow could hold 160 acres alone through a Kansas winter, that it would be a mercy, really, if the bank simply took the note and let her go back to people in Indiana. She turned the thin gold band on her finger with her thumb, the way she did when a thing was too large to look at all at once, and she set about the only thing she knew how to do, which was the next chore, and the one after that. Eli Brandt heard about Tom Greer at the forge, where the whole town came sooner or later, because everything that broke on a farm or a wagon ended up needing iron. He was the blacksmith of Wheat Cross, 35 years old, a big, quiet man gone gray before his time at the temples, with the deep chest and burned, scarred forearms of 20 years at an anvil. He had buried his own wife 4 winters back, Margaret, and the baby with her, both lost in a single hard night. The doctor reached too late, and he knew exactly what it was to come home to a house where the fire had to be built, by the same hands every time, where no one waited up, where a man could be strong all day at the anvil and still not be strong enough for the quiet after dark. So when the talk came through his shop that the Greer widow would surely lose the place, he set down his hammer and said nothing, and remembered the shingle he'd seen flapping loose on the Greer roof, clear from the road last spring, and how Tom had laughed and said he'd get to it. He went out the following Saturday with his wagon and a keg of cut nails and a stack of split shakes, and he did not knock. Hannah came out onto the porch with the broom still in her hand and found the blacksmith up on her roof in the cold, tearing off the rotted shingles over the kitchen where the water had come in all autumn, his breath smoking, his big hands sure and fast. She called up, and asked him what he thought he was doing. Eli looked down at her over the eave and took a moment, the way he took a moment before anything that mattered. "Tom asked me to look at this roof last spring," he said. "I told him I'd get to it. I'm a year late." Then he went back to work. Hannah stood in the yard with the broom and said nothing, and after a while she went in and built up the fire and put on the coffee, because a man working on your roof in the cold ought to have coffee, whatever else was true. That was the beginning of it, and it went on that way through the back half of October, the blacksmith arriving in the gray of a Saturday with no announcement and no expectation, doing the thing that needed doing, and saying almost nothing about it. He finished the roof so it would turn snow. The next week it was the wood. He found a pitiful woodpile, 3 days of split stove lengths, and a tumbled heap of unsplit rounds Tom had felled in August and never gotten to, and Eli took up the maul and split from after breakfast until the light failed, stacking it in a long, dry rick against the south wall, cord after cord, enough to burn until April. Will came and stood at the edge of the yard and watched the iron maul rise and fall, and after a while he came closer, and Eli set a wedge for him and showed him how to start a round with a hatchet, and the boy worked beside him the rest of the afternoon. And that night at supper, Will talked more than he had since the burying. The thing the town noticed, because the town noticed everything, was that the blacksmith's wagon was at the Greer place on Saturdays, and a town that had decided the widow could not hold her farm now had a far more interesting thing to decide: what exactly a widowed man was doing at a widow's home, with the husband not yet cold in the ground. Mrs. Dorcas Vane, wife of the man who owned the mercantile and held the paper on the Greer note, made certain the question was asked aloud where it would do the most damage. She was a thin, upright woman of 50, with a small, tight mouth and a great regard for what was proper, and she had her own reasons for wishing Hannah gone. The Greer quarter section ran alongside land her husband had long wanted, and a foreclosed widow makes for an easy purchase. So Mrs. Vane, weighing flour at her counter, would straighten the same tin of crackers she had already straightened, and remark that it was a pity, a new widow with no more sense of mourning than to have a man about the place on the Lord's day. And that, of course, she said nothing against anyone, but people would talk, and a woman's good name was the only thing the bank could not take from her, and a shame to lose it so cheap. Hannah heard it within the week, the way a woman always hears the thing said about her, from a neighbor who repeated it as a kindness and a warning. The next Saturday, when Eli's wagon came up the track, she met him in the yard before he could climb down, and told him plainly what was being said in town, and that she wouldn't have him made a fool of, and that perhaps it was better he didn't come. Eli sat with the reins loose in his scarred hands and looked at her a while. Then he climbed down anyway, slow. "Margaret died in January," he said, "4 winters back. I couldn't get the doctor through the drifts in time." He had never said it to her before. He set the brake. "I built a fire alone in that house every night for 4 years, and told myself a man's supposed to be able to. He's not. Nobody is." He took his tools down off the wagon. "Your stove's been smoking a week, and you've let it, because you can't spare the part. I can. It's the difference between a warm house and a cold one for that boy. I'm not courting your good name, Mrs. Greer. I'm fixing your stove. Let the town make of it what it wants." And he went in and pulled the cracked firebox grate, and Hannah stood in her own kitchen and watched a man kneel at her cold stove and felt the thing she had held clenched in her chest since the second Tuesday of October begin, very slightly, to ease. The stove was the turn of it, though neither of them would have called it that. Eli took the broken grate to the forge, and while he had the iron hot, he made the rest too. A new grate, a door latch that seated, a damper that worked, and fitted them the next Saturday, kneeling at the stove the better part of a cold afternoon, with the boy passing him tools. When he lit the fire at last, it caught and drew clean and steady, the flame standing straight, the room going warm in a way it had not been since Tom died. And Hannah Greer, who hadn't wept once where anyone could see, put her hand over her mouth and turned to the window, so the man and the boy would not see her face, because a stove that draws is a small thing, and it had undone her entirely. After the stove came supper, because a man who has worked at your place until the light fails has to be fed. So Hannah cooked, and Eli ate at the Greer table where Tom had sat. And at first it was awkward, and the chair was wrong. And then by slow degrees it was not. They did not speak of large things, only the stock, the weather, whether the well would freeze, how deep to bank the house against the cold. Will did most of the talking. A boy starved for a man to tell things to. And Eli listened with a grave, full attention that Hannah watched across the table and felt go straight through the cracked place in her. One evening Will asked the blacksmith, in the blunt way of a child, whether he was going to be their new pa, and the table went very still, and Eli set down his fork and took his time. "No, son," he said, "your pa was Tom Greer, and he'll always be your pa. I'm just a neighbor that's no good at sitting home." But he said it gently, and he did not say never, and Hannah turned the band on her finger under the table and did not correct him. The slow burn of it grew, the way a banked fire grows, through the first hard week of November, shared work, shared supper, the small daily intimacies of a place kept alive by two pairs of hands instead of one. Eli mended the barn door at last, the door Tom had laughed about, rehanging it true on iron hinges he had forged. Hannah carried coffee out to him in the cold, and stood a while in the doorway watching him work. And one gray afternoon, watching his burned hands gentle, a frightened heifer torn on the wire, with the same patient sureness he brought to iron. She understood the question was no longer whether she could hold the farm. She could hold the farm. The question was whether she would let herself, after Tom, want anything again, a far more dangerous thing than 160 acres and a Kansas winter. And she turned the thin band on her finger, and did not yet have an answer. The test came, as it had to, from the bank. In the third week of November, Mr. Josiah Vane sent word by his clerk that the Greer note was past due, which it was, and had been since Tom died, and the bank would call it, unless $240 was paid before the 1st of December. It was a true debt, but the timing was a chosen thing. 3 weeks after the burying, and everyone in Wheatcross understood that what the Vanes wanted was not the money, but the quarter section it was secured against. Hannah had $11 in a tin, a milk cow, and no way on earth to find $240 before December, and she sat at the new warm stove that night, with the boy asleep and the bank's notice in her hand, and turned the band on her finger until her thumb was raw. Eli Brandt found out about the note at the forge, and what he did about it was not what the town expected, nor what Hannah feared. He did not ride out and offer to pay the debt. He had the money. A careful man with 20 years at a forge, and no family to keep, had the money. but a lesser man would have laid $240 on her table and bought the trouble away, and she would have been beholden to him forever, a buying no better than the banks. Eli was not that kind of man, and Hannah was not that kind of woman. Instead, he stood in the Vane Mercantile on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hand among the gathered townsfolk, and asked Josiah Vane, plainly, what the Greer place would fetch at a forced sale. Vane, not seeing the trap, said a foreclosed quarter section with a poor name might bring $300, $350. Eli nodded and said that was strange, because the standing improvements alone, the new roof, the broken sod, the barn, the 80 acres cleared, were worth a sight more than a $240 note, and he wondered aloud, to the whole room, why a Christian bank in a Christian town would be in such a hurry to take $160 profit off a new widow and her boy, rather than carry a sound note one more season the way it had carried Tom Greer's for 10 years. And the room went quiet, and two of the men looked at the floor, and Josiah Vane's face went the color of his own counter. It was the saying of it out loud, in front of the town, that did what no payment could have done. The Vanes had counted on the foreclosure happening quietly, and a town will permit a great deal of cruelty so long as it is quiet and happening to someone else. But Eli had named it for what it was: a banker taking a widow's farm for $160 of profit. And once it was named, the town could no longer enjoy it. The men who owed Vane money and the women who bought his flour remembered that they too were a poor season from trouble. Old Henry Pruitt, who farmed the next section and had watched Tom break that sod, stood up by the cracker barrel and said he'd known the Greers 10 years, and the boy Will could near about run a team already, and that he for one would speak for the family's note. And another man said the same, and then a third. And by the time the talk had gone around Wheatcross twice, it was no longer the widow who was the scandal. It was the bank that had tried to take her farm. Josiah Vane carried the note. He had no choice that left him a name worth keeping, and he gave it out that he had, of course, never meant to press a grieving family, and had merely been following the bank's regular course, which fooled no one and saved his face, which was all anyone required of him. Mrs. Dorcas Vane never said another word against Hannah in the public room of the Mercantile, and the next time Hannah came in for salt and thread, Mrs. Vane weighed it out, named a fair price, and, squaring a jar on the shelf that did not need squaring, said stiffly that she was glad to hear the boy was keeping well, which from Dorcas Vane was as near to a kindness as the town would ever drag her. The verdict had turned. Hannah Greer was no longer the cursed widow of the failing Greer place. She was a neighbor the town had nearly wronged and was quietly ashamed of, and that, in a small town, amounts to the same thing as being restored. The first snow came on the last Saturday of November, soft and steady out of a low pewter sky, and Eli Brandt came out through it with his wagon, as he always did, and found Hannah waiting for him on the porch he had re-roofed. Beside the long rick of wood he had split, the warm light of the stove he had mended falling out the kitchen window onto the new snow. He stopped the wagon in the yard, and something in how she stood made him set the brake and come no farther, and wait. And Hannah came down off the porch into the falling snow and stood in front of him and said the thing she had been turning over since the night the stove first drew clean. She had spent the autumn, she said, telling herself she let him come, because the work needed doing, and the boy needed a man about, and a widow can't be choosy about help. That was true, and it was also a lie, and she was done with the lie. She did not need him to save her. She could hold the farm now. The note was carried, and she would not be any man's charity. "But I find," she said, turning the thin band on her finger one last time, and then, deliberately, going still and letting it be. "I'd rather not face the winter listening for a wagon that isn't going to come. So I'm asking you, Eli Brandt. Not because I have to. Because I'd like you at my table for more than supper." Eli Brandt got down off the wagon into the snow. For a man who took his time before he said anything that mattered, he did not take it then. He had been in love, he said, with the brave, stubborn way she had of refusing to be pitied since about the second Saturday. And he had kept coming out partly for the boy and the roof, and mostly because hers was the only kitchen in 4 winters where the quiet after dark hadn't hurt. He would not try to be Tom Greer, and didn't want to. Tom had broken this ground and given her this boy, and would always have his place. But if she'd have him, he would mend every broken thing on the place for the rest of his life, and never once call it charity. And would be proud, past saying, to build a fire in a house where somebody waited up. And then, because he was a blacksmith and not a man of speeches, he reached into the wagon and took out the last thing he had forged for her, made in the firelight after the others were done, a wrought iron lantern bracket, scrolled and sure, with a hook to hold a lit lantern, the kind a family hangs by the door to light the children home from the barn in the dark. He had meant it for the doorpost, so Will would have a light coming in from chores in the deep of winter. He turned it over once in his big scarred hands and held it out to her in the falling snow, and Hannah Greer took the cold iron from him with both hands and looked at it and looked at him and said yes. They were married in the frame church in Wheatcross 2 days before Christmas of 1883, on a hard, bright morning with the snow squeaking underfoot, and the whole town that had nearly wronged her packed into the pews. Old Henry Pruitt, standing up as a witness, the neighbor women who had left the ham now leaving cakes, even Josiah and Dorcas Vane near the back in their good clothes, which in that town was its own slow apology. Will stood beside his mother in a new collar, solemn as a deacon, and when the Reverend asked who gave this woman, the boy gave her hand to Eli Brandt himself, having insisted on the office with an 8-year-old's gravity. Hannah wore Tom's thin gold band on her right hand now, and a new plain ring on her left, and didn't feel, as she had feared she would, that she was leaving Tom behind, only that the house would be warm, and the boy would have a man to tell things to, and the lamp would be lit. The lantern hook went up on the doorpost the first week they were married, Eli setting it with 4 iron screws he'd forged himself, while Will held the lantern ready. And from that night on, through the long Kansas winter, there was a light burning at the Greer place after dark, for it was still the Greer place. Eli would not hear of changing the name of the ground Tom had broken, and said the boy would carry it. Every evening Will lit the lantern and hung it on the iron bracket by the door, and its light fell out across the snow, and Hannah would see it from the kitchen window and think only that the stove drew clean, and the roof turned snow, and the wood would last till April, and the man splitting the last of it in the yard would be in directly for supper. The next spring Eli built on 2 rooms onto the south side of the house, and a proper smithy in the barn, so he could shoe the neighbors' teams without the ride to town. He plowed and seeded the 80 cleared acres, with Will riding the harrow proud as a king, and the wheat that came up came thick and green, and even, the best the Greer place had ever carried, as if the ground had only been waiting for somebody to stay. On a warm green evening in May, with the wheat shimmering and the lantern hanging dark on its hook because the days were long again, Hannah stood on the porch Eli had re-roofed and watched her husband and her son walk up from the field together, and laid her hand flat over the small new round of her belly where another child was coming with the harvest, and she did not turn the band on her finger, because there was no longer anything too large to look at all at once. She thought of Tom, who had loved this ground and her and the boy with everything he had, and who had laughed and promised, of every broken thing on the place. "I'll get to it." He would have been glad, she believed, that it had all been gotten to at last, that the roof was sound, and the fire drew clean, and the people he left behind were not cold. As the dark came down, she lit the lantern out of long habit, though the boy could have found his way blind, and hung it on Eli Brandt's iron hook by the door, and its small warm light fell out across the green yard where the first one had fallen across the snow, and the house behind it was full of supper and voices, and there was, at last, on the rise above the broken field where a hopeful man lay sleeping, nothing left on the place that needed mending. And so, another lamp goes dim on the homestead. Stay a while, and tell me in the comments if this one found you.